Good evening, my friends. As the January 6th breach of the Capitol remains unresolved, Governor Ron DeSantis' comments cut through the politics of the event. He said that the legacy media would milk the situation for all it's worth, blaming the demonstrators and Trump for inciting violence. Okay, my friends, let's take a closer look together. Welcome to the Eye Opener. I'm your host, Michael Lewis. Questions about the cause, perception, and characterization of the storming of the Capitol on January 6 last year remain unresolved and contentious. In her speech Thursday, Vice President Kamala Harris compared the riot to the September 11th terrorist attacks and the attack on Pearl Harbor, two foreign attacks on the United States that claimed thousands of lives and sparked American retaliation. And when Biden spoke, he bluntly blamed the riots on Trump's refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election, accusing his predecessor of creating and spreading a web of lies about the 2020 election. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said the January 6 event would be politicized to stir up hostility towards Trump supporters. Coverage of the event will be nauseating in mainstream media, which will use the event to milk it for everything it can to try and discredit anyone who has ever supported Donald Trump. More than 700 people were arrested in the wake of this riot, and many of the rioters are being held in Washington, D.C. jails awaiting trial. Although many news outlets labeled the rioters insurrectionists, none of the defendants have been charged with sedition or insurrection. He went on to say that anyone who committed a crime during the riots must be held accountable. But it's also an insult to people when you say it was an insurrection and then a year later, no one has been charged. He said, "I think it's going to end up being just a politicized Charlie Foxtrot. I don't expect anything good to come out of anything that Pelosi and the gang are doing. I don't expect anything from the corporate press to be enlightening." He argued that Floridians don't care about the riot and said his focus will be on issues that matter to voters, noting that inflation, gas prices, jobs, and education are his priorities. He wishes Congress would focus on these pressing issues as well, but sadly, they don't. Some of the loudest voices among them will instead probably end up vacationing in Florida at some point as well. Former President Donald Trump responded to President Biden's sharp criticism in a January 6 speech, saying his Democratic successor trying to distract Americans from his poor governing record. He pointed out that the country no longer has borders, has completely and utterly lost control of COVID-19, is no longer energy independent, and inflation is rampant. The military is in chaos, judging the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and much more. He said, "Biden used my name today to try to further divide America." One of the men we often see in videos about the January 6th breach, who is walking around freely, encouraged protesters to enter the Capitol, goes by the name of John Earl Sullivan. He brags about being an insurgent on his social media accounts while he curses former President Donald Trump. He was the head of the group Insurgent USA. On January 6th, the 27-year-old was seen encouraging violence and pushing crowds forward on the day. He suggests protesters block the road, threatened to beat a woman sitting in her car, kicked in her door, and was then seen to be in contact with the alleged gunman. He carried a knife into the Capitol and offered to use it, broke a window, and ordered officers to leave their posts. In his video, he talked about burning and destroying things throughout the building and on the grounds. Court records show that when veteran Ashley Babbitt was shot and killed, Sullivan was just steps away from her calmly shooting video. And he even sold the footage he took of the incident for $90,000. But what defies logic, unlike some 80 others who have been jailed for up to 300 days for storming the Capitol, Sullivan was allowed to return home to Utah while he awaits a trial date on 8 criminal charges. One of the longest jailed protesters, Kenneth Harrelson, was accused of squeezing into the Capitol behind a mob. He was inside for 18 minutes, walked around, taking photographs, and was not charged with any violent acts in court documents reviewed by the Washington Examiner. Sullivan was arrested in his home state of Utah on January 14, 2021. A federal judge refused to allow a hearing, and he was released to home confinement the next day, complete with an ankle monitoring device. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene questioned this, saying that John Sullivan is a professional rioter. So why is this man free to walk around? He organized and instigated violence, almost like a commander telling people what to do. He even profited from the video of Ashley Babbitt's death. He was actually treated very well in the two-tiered justice system. Why, she asked, was there no record of Liz Cheney subpoenaing him? Why didn't Nancy Pelosi mention his name? On Monday, Sullivan said on a YouTube show, "They are terrorists of Trump seeking to overthrow our country. That's why I went to the Capitol, just to expose them and hold them accountable." Sullivan said, "My footage put probably 300 people in jail, and I did what I set out to do." It finally dawned on people that Sullivan's purpose in going to the Capitol was to lure some protesters into their preset trap and film them leaving behind the so-called evidence that he was a decoy. Who was behind him to give him such a mission? The answer is self-explanatory. This is why people cannot trust the January 6th Commission. In the years since the Capitol breach, alternative social media platforms have grown by leaps and bounds, driven by conservative users' dissatisfaction with big tech censorship and privacy policies. These alternative media platforms give those censored by Facebook and Twitter a new way to express themselves. They have better policies, more transparency, privacy, and security. Challengers to Facebook and Twitter, such as Rumble, Getter, and MeWe, have added millions of users to their respective platforms in the past year by promoting concerns about free speech and data privacy. These emerging platforms say social media giants are pushing users into their arms by suppressing conservative views. MeWe has added more than 10 million users in the past year and has about 20 million users, while Parler has 15.5 million users. And the Getter platform, founded by former Trump spokesman Jason Miller last summer, has more than 4 million users. Mark Weinstein, founder and chairman of MeWe, said that his alternative social media platform has been favored by independents and liberals. Facebook will remove what it doesn't like, and they've decided that their wallets and surveillance capitalism are more important than democracy and privacy. Weinstein thinks those are vital. He pointed to what he sees as Facebook's unfair double standards in content review and its alleged harm to children as central to users' frustration with the platform. Getter, which describes itself as a free speech-oriented and opposed to a culture of cancellation, announced earlier this week that more than 500,000 new users had joined in the past few days since popular broadcaster Joe Rogan joined on Sunday. Some alternative platforms, such as Parler and Rumble, have set up their own servers over the past year to avoid having their sites censored or restricted by a handful of big tech companies, including Amazon, Apple, and Google. Parler was founded in 2018 and describes itself as a platform to protect free speech. It has been popular with conservatives and was the most downloaded app in the App Store around the presidential election last year. Facebook, which owns Instagram and WhatsApp, is the world's largest social media company, with billions of users worldwide, while Twitter has 330 million monthly active users. Despite the growth of alternative platforms over the past year, social media giants such as Facebook and Twitter still dominate and are poised to continue to control the conversation. In terms of scale and influence, it could take years before alternative platforms are likely to catch up with big tech platforms. But now they have a new weapon. Big tech challengers like Parler and MeWe are betting big on creating a strong presence on Web3, a new iteration of the internet that incorporates blockchain based on decentralization. The main features of Web3 is the creation of a freer version of the internet where users can access websites and transfer their data from one service to another without big tech companies like Amazon Web Services, Facebook, or Google blocking it. These new alternative platforms hope to attract users to their websites by gaining a jumping-off point on Web3, a growing ecosystem that could form an important part of online interaction in the future. Journalist and author Tara Henley wrote a scathing letter of resignation to the government-funded Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, accusing it of peddling so-called social justice dogma, banning free debate, and racially profiling special guests in the name of fairness. She also noted similar problems with U.S. news organizations. Henley resigned from the news network this week after nearly a decade of her work, which also appeared in various media outlets in the U.S. and the U.K. Henley published a similar resignation letter article on her new Substack blog and in the conservative-leaning National Post. The article writes that since she began working at the CBC, the corporation has gone from being a trusted news source to hype, clickbait, and bad journalism that reads like a parody of a student newspaper. Henley claims that the CBC's management has fully embraced a radical political agenda that originated on Ivy League campuses in the United States and forbids any questioning of so-called sober political ideas. According to Henley, this agenda extends to the selection of guests to appear on the CBC's programs. According to her letter, journalists were required to fill out a racial profile form when booking guests to ensure that they booked more people of a certain race and fewer of others. In choosing the topics to cover, Henley said that the CBC's management had no interest in covering real hot topics like city closures, vaccine mandates, and school closures that are causing sweeping changes in society. Instead, the priority was to cover less controversial news and the thoughts of ordinary people that Twitter doesn't like. Henley said she had been receiving complaints from readers and viewers about the network's editorial direction for months. She wrote, "People want to know why, for example, non-binary Filipinos concerned about a lack of LGBT terms in Tagalog is an editorial priority for the CBC when local issues of broad concern go unreported." Henley is not alone in her dislike of the CBC, and she is far from the first person in recent years to rail against the so-called sober mainstream media. She, like other journalists, has left the mainstream media that made them famous to pursue editorial freedom on platforms such as Substack. Former New York Times columnist Barry Weiss and The Intercept co-founder Glenn Greenwald have migrated to Substack over the past year or so. Both accused their former employers of ideological censorship, and even Vox co-founder Matthew Iglesias, an avowed liberal, was quick to follow suit. Henley said she has been contacted by a number of prominent American journalists since her article brought attention. The feedback has helped her realize that she is not the only one who thinks things need to change. She believes that the partisan policies of news organizations are being institutionalized and that it will therefore become increasingly difficult to restore diversity of thought in newsrooms without radical change. What journalists need is curiosity, critical thinking, and a willingness to talk to people from all walks of life, to go in with an open mind and without bias, and see what the story is, rather than decide and amplify it in advance. News organizations cannot exclude broad stories that need to be covered that affect a wide range of people. Nearly a year after former President Donald Trump left office, two Rasmussen polling center polls released on January 6 show that Republican voters approve of Trump at 85%. Now, that's up from 84% when he left office. A telephone poll of 1,000 voters conducted by the Rasmussen on January 4th to the 5th showed that 52% of U.S. voters support Trump, with 33% of them strongly supporting him. 47% do not support Trump. And among Republican voters, 85% of Republican voters support Trump, of whom 63% strongly support him, 23% of Democrats and 51% of independents also strongly support Trump. This suggests that Trump's support has increased since he left office. A poll conducted by the Polling Center on January 20th last year showed that public support for Trump was 51%, with Republicans at 84%. The poll shows that support for Trump is still on the rise, despite attempts by Democrats and the mainstream media to blame Trump for the riots that erupted at the Capitol on January 6 last year, and to blame Trump for dividing America. Trump has strongly hinted that he will run for president again in 2024, while Biden has said he will run again if Trump does. A Rasmussen poll of 1,000 U.S. voters conducted by the center on January 2nd through 3rd showed that only 28% of U.S. voters believed that Biden would win if he ran for president in 2024. 37% believed that he would lose to the Republican candidate if he ran in 2024. 21% believed that Biden would resign before the end of his current term. And only 55% of Democratic voters believe that Biden would win a second presidential term. And that's it for today, my friends. Check out the playlist right here for more eye-opening content. You can join me in the eye-opening Telegram chat room and follow me on Newmaker, Gab, Parler, and Getter. Now, don't forget, please sign up to the email list so that we can stay in touch. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next time.